All right.
Need a search optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
Good evening. Welcome to Pump Up the Volume. It is Tuesday, 7:39. If you're joining us, this is Pump Up the Volume, streaming on the Coalition Talk Show Radio Network. Here today, what we do in Pump Up the Volume is to amplify the voices of communities that are often unheard, bringing issues to surface that mainstream media and mainstream politics do not want addressed. Joining me today are my Pump Up the Volume co-host per se, Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town Podcast. Thank you for joining us today, Bill. We have Mr. Roberto Gonzalez from Steambox, Rhode Island. Thank you so much for joining us, Roberto. And we have Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Coalition Talk Show Radio Network, and again, joining us on Pump Up the Volume to bring, again, to amplify the voices of communities. So today, to provide some structure, and we've been doing this over the past 2 weeks, and it seems to have worked, what we're going to address are several topics. We're going to get some updates from Bill about what's happening on the ground, what some of the challenges are with this continued pandemic and some of the social issues that arise in parallel with that. We're also going to touch on small businesses, specifically micro entities in Rhode Island and their struggle for resources. We're going to transition that to our education system, which ultimately will be impacted in as much as our local economies are being impacted. And then we're going to sum it up into some of our outrage over the past week and in moving forward into next week. So Bill, if you'd like to start us off with an update of what's been going on for the past 7 days and what we should know, it would be great. Thanks, Bill.
Well, good evening, everyone out there, and always a pleasure to be here with each of you on this Tuesday evening tradition now here in the Ocean State. Look, over the weekend, it was there's two ways to look at this one. It was sort of a celebration of the fact that many folks here in Rhode Island or in the Northeast are looking at it the crisis, the COVID crisis, and saying, "Wow, our percent positive is much lower than the rest of the country, so let's get out there and enjoy ourselves." And then on the other hand, there were folks who were saying, wow, our percent positive rate is relatively low right now, so let's keep it that way and kind of keep everything dialed in. I'm looking at the data right now. I just wanted to make sure I had it right. The test positivity rate on Sunday hit a low of 0.7%. However, there's also somewhere in the neighborhood of about an 8-day lag in testing right now as far as results. So as the state is opening up more and more, as people are going out on Block Island, as people are starting to go out in Newport, South County, even in Providence and the urban core at large, we haven't seen the relative impact of what that will look like here in the Ocean State. So the data, yes, I believe we had a total of 9 deaths since, I believe, Thursday night. I'm trying to clarify if that's it is, yes. So the entire weekend through yesterday, we've had 9 deaths here in Rhode Island. However, what does that mean for 2 weeks from now, 3 weeks from now, and how reliable are these data points that we're looking at? Those are the big questions, and I think it's just two completely different responses to the situation that we're in the Ocean State.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that, Bill. I mean, certainly, I think we've seen a kind of relaxation, and I guess you would see that in a reopening of the economy. But I think seeing it in terms of the public, you almost wonder whether there's kind of narrative that is bleeding into some of the scientific rationalization that has happened over time, and whether this low positivity rate is somehow indicative of the virus not being as transmissible. To the contrary, there's actually been some evidence over the past 2 weeks that the strand that we're faced with here in the US actually is an evolved strand that actually came from Europe. So, in the life of a virus, they can evolve, and it's actually more transmissible than the initial COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 strand. And so scientists would say you can't call it a strand unless its survivability is greater, whether it can survive in strenuous environments. So that might not be the appropriate term to use, but I just want to point out that in terms of the transmissibility of the SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19 that we're facing in the US, it is actually still very highly transmissible. So everyone should pay attention and not get too relaxed. Young people do die, and those that don't die still suffer strokes and at times amputations. So thanks for the update, Bill. So taking that update and kind of now, bringing it home in terms of what it means in the context of reopening this economy, the lieutenant governor and some other advocates within mainstream politics have taken to the talk show radio streams and mainstream outlets to voice their desire for elements or a certain quantity of the CARES Act funds to be allocated to small businesses and micro entities throughout the state. Now, I'm being very friendly in adding micro entities there. Those are the mom and pop shops, the pizzerias, right? They're saying small business. That's always been a concern of mine, that there's a difference between a small business making 10 million a year versus a micro entity making just enough for salary, right, to survive and to have a service or provide a service to the community. And so with all this talk about how to help micro entities and how to get this money across, in light of the fact that the governor controls over $1 billion in this stimulus package capital, right? The question for me remains, like, what is Commerce Rhode Island doing today to either show that it does care about micro entities and small businesses, or that it's heading in a direction to actually take care of small businesses and micro entities? And I'd invite all of you to add your thoughts and any historical kind of evidence to build a case here, because I'm really confused about where we are and where we're going and whether it's to protect our local economies.
Well, the first stage of confusion, I just want to throw out one rhetorical question for the show here, and in my outrage, I'll discuss it. At what point did Rhode Island did knowledge die? At what point in time did we as a nation become science deniers? Just want to throw that out. Here in Rhode Island, we've got a colossal governmental collision about to take place. You've got the traditional Rhode Island governmental structure, for whom Stephen Pryor, the Commerce Corporation Secretary, is a member, if you will, of the governor's inner circle. I was about to say president. Freudian slip there. But he is a member of her inner circle, and a significant part of her efforts, if you will, if you want to dignify them with that, over the last 7 years, have been working business stimulus through Commerce Corporation. Now you've got the specter of a lieutenant governor who kind of makes up his own rules as he goes along, and has decided that the beach he's going to die on is going to be this all of a sudden newfound interest in small business. The very both of these groups over the past generation have done everything they can to exterminate small business, but I guess the lieutenant governor who's going to run for governor has now all of a sudden found an issue that he can run with, and particularly appeal to a conservative Democratic base. Here's the problem. Technically, the lieutenant governor's right. I mean, that money is supposed to go to small business. To echo your concern, what needs to happen right away is for them to define specifically who can apply for that money. We've all been treated in the last 24 to 48 hours of the best clickbait all year, which is finding out who exactly scored during the early stages of the CARES Act and got the big scuttle, the do-re-mi, the bucks. And, it ain't pretty, because a lot of people who make a lot of money off of government already basically just got their operations supplemented with low-interest loans and or grants now going forward. So the first demand has got to be a thorough understanding of the who, what, whys, and hows of this money, and who's going to get it, how they're going to get it. Is it going to be circulated through the banking cycle so the banksters can make their cut of the action? All of that's got to be spelled out before we just knee-jerk respond to one guy's emotional plea for relevance.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Pat, when people throw out these ideas about giving a $10,000 to $15,000 grant to micro entities that may, need it, and maybe it might give them some runway for 2 to 3 months, the question does become, who those where those grants will be allocated, who will get the grants, and whether, there's only a limited amount of grants, right? Because if that's the case, we're in a state where favoritism plays a significant role in who gets money, who doesn't. Even with nonprofit organizations, we see that. And so again, and I know where you're coming from, Pat. How do we create an equitable formula, equitable approach here, where everyone gets a fair shot, especially businesses that have put their blood and sweat into the business for years. So I do want to provide Bill and Roberto with an opportunity to speak to this issue or any facet of the issue if you'd like.
I can tell you that as Steambox is a very small education nonprofit, and a lot of the PPP loans were designed. So if we're talking about the Scarol, right? Like if we're talking about where the money comes in, a lot of that's designed for small businesses, and we saw initially that it wasn't a lot of the small businesses that were cleaning up on it. It was a lot of the larger businesses, and I could tell you that Steambox is ineligible because of the way our employee structure works. Right, like we've got an executive director, we've got a bunch of contractors, and without 9 to 10 employees, like we're just not even eligible for the PPP. So I know I'm speaking on behalf of Steambox, and we're doing okay, but I'm relating and thinking about a number of the businesses who don't structure in the exact way that are going to even qualify them. So, I'm struggling with the way that a lot of the loans are going out, and I'm struggling with a lot of other elements of the pandemic as well. I know right now we're talking about our local businesses, but I'm also looking at the way some of the hospitals are responding and going against state standards. I happen to be very close with some former students and some people within the family who have to work in the hospitals, and one by one, people are getting hit with the COVID, and it's actually being discouraged to test for the COVID because they're afraid of losing workers. And I'm seeing this on a number of, like, this is consistent. It's not just in one department and at one place. So our response for the businesses, our response for education, our response for even our healthcare workers could all use improvement. I know it's an emergency situation and we're learning as we go, but that doesn't mean that we can't be doing better right now.
Yeah, look, thanks for sharing that, Roberto. Sorry, Bill. Just to point out, Roberto, you have a little bit of an echo there. All right. Thanks. I did want to point one thing before Bill speaks to this issue as well. I thought it was really interesting. Speaking of Lieutenant Governor Dan McKee and the work he's done with the Blackstone Valley Prep, right? Blackstone Valley Prep actually secured a loan for about $4 million, was it? It was pretty significant. I'll have to research the number, but I'm pretty sure that it was close to $4 million. What's your perspective on that from a place of like being a nonprofit focused on education and seeing that there's just a disproportionate amount of funds going to a single educational system? What are your thoughts?
Unfortunately, I'm used to that being the way business works, right? Like I'm used to that happening here. I've noticed having worked before with a number of the larger organizations like PASA, like the College Crusade, these places with very large overhead. It seems like there's less of the response, there's less of the work actually happening with some of these organizations, right? Than in the smaller organizations like Arise, like DARE, like Steambox. And yet those larger organizations have the capacity to go out and actually get that money back in.
I guess I'd like a better understanding of what the process was, though. And I understand, I've seen through my own work environments, I've seen some of the financial statements, but the disproportionality of some of these grants, quite frankly, is alarming. And I'm going to ask a really hard question that really no one wants to discuss. Really, really. How many of these businesses that we're giving this money to are doomed for failure anyway? And does that have to be part of the consideration? Now, that's pretty harsh, right? But there is the concept here that we're just throwing cash out, and will we ever see any of it again, or is it just being used to cover or temporarily resuscitate a bad situation? I don't have an answer to that, by the way. I'll just throw that out.
Yeah, and I've got serious questions about this. It's exactly why I asked Brett Smiley on Wednesday for a list of all the recipients and breakdown of how that process came. His response was to go to their Reopening RI website, which I did, and found the most recent entry dated May 26th. So my observations on this distribution right now are, from just a cursory glance at some of the latest data, is that you have businesses, you have operations, restaurants. I'll give you one example. I won't mention the name of it, but an LLC. I looked into who the LLC was. They received a substantial loan, and it turns out this particular small business, quote unquote, which already has 2 restaurants, is now in the process of opening a 3rd restaurant. And you can make the argument, well, isn't that great that they're going to employ X number of more people? But in reality, they're using that for capital improvement and for expanding their business. They're actually going to keep their workforce at the same size. That's coming from information that I've gathered from just looking into this one specific example. You've got museums that have collected millions and millions of dollars in loans, then have gone and laid off 69% of their workforce as a result. You've got tourism councils that have collected substantial loans that have completely shut down their operations. So, and that's just scratching the surface. There's no question about it that there's something about this program that is very unsettling, and we're not going to really be able to understand the impact of this from a management perspective, or perhaps mismanagement perspective, as you pointed out, Pat, until we get to the point where we realize, hey, dog catcher business X would have gone out of business whether you pump $20 million into them or not. And we get to the point where these businesses fold a year from now because of their inherent mismanagement or the bloated nature of their organizations. And that's a problem we can't do anything about until, we look back on this crisis and say, wow, that was a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Commerce Rhode Island has a clue as to what its role is, right? I mean, you look at debt, bank debt, and how businesses often use it. It's really for growth. You look, it's not to pay employees. It's not for day-to-day operations. At least it shouldn't be. And those businesses that make that mistake often do fail quickly. But you look at venture capital, right? Angel investments, you see those monies oftentimes allocated to staff, right? To kind of sustaining operations within an 18-month runway. And so Commerce Rhode Island right now, again, in implementing processes or ideas as to how it's going to help micro entities, the first question we all need to face is, are we helping businesses based on the current operational needs sustain themselves for 2 to 3 months with the expectation that they can sustain the local economy? Are we betting on businesses and expecting them to boom or bust? Because if it's the latter, Rhode Island has a track record of failure, right? Rhode Island does not know how to pick winners. And that's not, I'm not saying that it should have a role. Yeah, I'm not saying that it should have a role, right? But the fact is it doesn't have a good track record. And that's a byproduct of putting corporate political figures in positions of authority that don't have the vision or out-of-the-box thinking that's necessary to take a unique, diverse business environment like Rhode Island and to transform it into a tech cultural epicenter right here in New England. But that change is coming. That change is coming. So as we approach change, let's confront the realities. And the realities are that not only are we not investing in local economies and micro entities, we don't even have a backup plan for when the Department of Health shuts these businesses down because their workers become COVID-19 positive, right? And so we are on the precipice of getting to a point of actually actively destroying businesses here in Rhode Island, not just due to negligence, but through enforcement of some of these public health measures. And so when we get there, we're going to see an impact on municipal taxes. Right now, I have been an advocate, and certainly Pat's been probably the biggest advocate here of no taxes, but I have been an advocate of reducing tangible property taxes. I think it hurts micro entities. I think the formula that's used to address tangible property taxes here in Rhode Island is unfair, unjust, and archaic because you're paying taxes on things that are over 10 years old. So there's an issue with it. But given that we're in this crisis and that we do have public institutions to fund, like education. Without a local economy, we're going to see certain communities that already have financial challenges in their education system and health systems now suffer even more. And those communities happen to be the communities that are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19, Pawtucket, Providence, Central Falls, and there are others in the state. But, in terms of the ones that we often hear of, let's lift those up and say, call it for what it is. So now bringing it back to education, and Bill, maybe you can start us off, how do we bridge our understanding of the impact that COVID-19 has had on the economy, seeing that there's really no vision to protect the local economies and what that means for our education system and moving forward? What is the issue, and what are your thoughts on how we can actually address it?
Wow. I mean, the issue is so complex that we'd spend the whole summer, we could go nightly and spend the whole summer. And there's so many different approaches to it. I'm sure Pat would advocate for more of a private sector or an entirely private sector role in education. There are folks that would push for the removal of charter schools entirely and entirely going in a public direction. But it comes down to funding, right? You look at Central Falls and the amount of cuts that they're experiencing, not just to extracurricular programs or things that you could argue, and again, I'm not saying this is the right move, but you could argue could be picked up by the private sector, music, athletics, and so forth. You don't want to see that, or I don't want to see that, but you could make an argument that that could happen. What you can't make up for are school nurse teachers who are being cut. You can't make up for the fact that basic supplies aren't available for reading, writing, arithmetic, take place inside the schoolhouse. So the funding formula is broken, and COVID-19 has just further illuminated the disparity in our society. And if you're in Barrington, East Greenwich, South Kingstown right now, even Cumberland to an extent, you may very well say, hey, you know what? We're not really feeling the impact of COVID-19. It's going to be more of a question of whether or not there's a safety issue, right? Whereas in other districts right now, you're saying, wow, from a fiscal management perspective, Tiverton, Central Falls, to an extent, Newport, they can't come up with an agreement to merge the Quinnipiac Island schools right now to form a regional school district at a time where it couldn't be more apparent from an economic standpoint it's necessary. So we have to get to a point now where there's a mutual understanding that the funding formula is broken, number one, and number two, that there's going to have to be consolidation and cuts in areas that aren't specifically related to the fundamentals of education that should be happening inside school buildings. COVID should have illuminated that for us. The fact that it didn't is very scary.
But the fact that the Johns Hopkins report didn't illuminate that is even scarier. You see, ultimately, when Governor Raimondo was elected treasurer and was talking about pension reform, her catchphrase at the time was, it's the math. And the problem that Rhode Island is facing is that we are in a death spiral right now fiscally. Some would say philosophically as well. But for the purpose of this conversation, what you've got happening right now, just for example, in the public employee systems, is that the only way that municipalities are going to be able to survive this is to cut. And in doing so, they were forced early retirements. Now, Bill was there when I brought up the municipal pension system here in Rhode Island. And I believe there are 6 or 7 communities which have plans at a minimum at the municipal level that are on what they call the critical list. And the champion of all time, and possibly, and this is not rhetoric, this is fact, possibly the worst pension system in America is in Providence. Now, just the defined benefit system is underfunded by over $1 billion. Yes, that was a B, $1 billion. Now, that calculation was done pre-COVID market corrections and pre-anticipated corrections that are going to take place when the anticipated wave of municipal bank, I'll call it Main Street bankruptcies, are going to take place. You see, everyone thinks right now that we're kind of, and on a health basis, Rhode Island, I got to say, scorecard. Right now, Rhode Island is the beacon nationally in terms of statistics. But what's about to happen, the rise of bankruptcies post-stimulus, the rise of bankruptcies and business closures post-lease renewals, and that's, to me, that has been the uncalculated, that's the unknown. All right, because how many businesses will continue to flounder about when they no longer have to, make that lease, when they can just end it mercifully? The tax base in this state is about to implode, and that's why at every one of our press conferences, I'm talking about asset sales, getting rid of things off the books, making the big sale, making the big adjustment. How does this answer your question, Doctor? All right, if our spending formula is screwed right now, if $19,000 to $20,000 per year is spent, and I love Roberto's reaction to this, so I'll give him the mic in a second here, if you will, because he's got the real inside sense for this. But if we can't make $19,000 to $20,000 per student work right now, what are we going to do when we're able to afford $8,000 or $9,000 per student? And what are we going to do post the imminent municipal bankruptcy of at least 3 or 4 communities in the state? So it's about to get a lot worse really quickly.
Yeah, Roberto, I think Pat just handed it off to you. You're on mute.
Hey, Roberto? I think we may have...
No, he's there. We can't hear you, Roberto. We can't hear you.
Got to pump up the volume. Okay.
Yeah. All right. As Roberto puts his headphones on, and we'll wait to hear his response. I think it's certainly a challenge that we're confronted with. I just want to throw this out there. I think it's time to kick open the doors to our universities that have not been paying taxes, like Brown University. I think it's time to demand some service in lieu of taxes. I think it's time to take those pretty classrooms that likely will have plexiglass by 2021 in some shape or form, and to help our students in Providence and other municipalities that are struggling to get a good education, a quality education. And if those universities aren't willing to step up today, then I think it's time that they pay taxes like everyone else. And if they can't afford the taxes and all the sandwich shops that they have built on our land, then we can go ahead and confiscate those businesses as well. I mean, at the end of the day, other businesses are shutting down here because of the tax burden, right? Other businesses are being threatened to shut down. And here we have a university that in many respects is not only scapegoating taxes because of its university status, but is building companies within the kind of shell of it being a university or nonprofit. And so there, that might be a little radical and controversial, but it's about time that we start challenging these institutions that either way made their money off the slave trade anyway, right? So it's just about time that they start paying the same amount that we're paying. Roberto, you're still on mute. Yeah, we can't hear you. All right. So as we have technical issues, Roberto, with that said, let's transition here, and we can always address this towards a later portion of this segment when we are all discussing what's very important to us. And education is very important to Roberto. And so Roberto will be exiting for just a moment, and then we'll be coming on due to the technical issues. But as I mentioned, we have to start thinking innovatively and outside the box on how we address these institutions that will not have adequate funding due to the losses and taxes that the local economies will likely suffer. Therefore, the municipalities will suffer. And going to our universities and demanding those services might be a way for a short-term fix, and maybe even a long-term fix in terms of addressing performance issues. I also want to point out here that that as we think about kind of moving forward in the education system, and we think about equitable formulas in terms of how we invest in micro entities in Rhode Island and how we invest in education, here's the reality. I say it every week, and I want to say it again. Over 3 weeks ago on the Equity Council, Roberto Gonzalez and I and others from Sister Fire organization in Providence as well actually requested, and I would say some even demanded, that the administration present us with an equity formula, a pathway towards equity for our education system, how we were going to test our students, how we were going to fund school systems with the COVID-19 preparation funds that were promised by this administration. We also stressed, other areas such as small businesses. We stressed food access. We stressed housing, right, and the eviction crisis that we're facing. At every point in terms of education, the testing system, the capital investments, homelessness, as well as small business, the answers were always this: we will get to you in a couple of weeks. We will bring Stephen Pryor on. We will bring the Commissioner of Education on. Always, we will, we will, we will. We are less than 2 months away from schools opening, right? We are less than 2 months away from businesses closing. We are less than a month away from starting to already see the byproduct of some of these evictions, right, that are coming down the line. And already the processes have already started. And so what are we going to do? I'm sick of there being talk after talk about equity and nothing is happening. And unless you, the listeners, the people in the community, start to rise up, start to vote people out, and possibly start to run yourselves to bring some common sense into government, things will not change. And please, just because they put a tokenized person on the stage that may look like you, do not assume that that person is challenging an administration that is paying them on a weekly, bi-weekly basis, right? That's just the reality. And if this gets some people angry, so be it. But Bill, myself, Pat, and Roberto Gonzalez are here on this show to speak truth to power. But the fact is that action can't only come from us. It needs to come from you. So I'm going to leave that conversation there and allow all of the co-hosts on this show to address it if they want specifically. But I do want to address another big issue, and I'd love to get Bill's take on this first, and then we can follow up with Pat, which is that the ACLU and the Rhode Island Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, seem to have implemented, established, and or advocated for nomination signature process that in their minds seem just. And yet they didn't consider many of the technology access challenges that people in the public would have. In other words, people in the public may not have a printer and then a scanner to essentially print a form out, to sign it, and then to scan it, independent of whether they have the time to do that. And so we have people collecting nomination signatures, asking people to essentially not only have a printer, but to have a scanner, or if they don't, putting the community at risk and putting themselves at risk by going in person to collect a signature. Now, to all of those that had the courage, got the signatures, a part of me feels like good for you. But there's another side of this, which is that the risk wasn't only towards the person or from the person or to the person that was collecting the signatures. The risk also related to the people that were providing the signatures. And that risk was not something that the community accepted, right? It was a risk that was put upon the community by an administration that seems to care more about politics than protecting lives. And what we could have done at this point in time, and Pat has advocated for this for a long time, is removing the nomination signature requirement. Because what Pat may explain later in much more depth than I can is that there's no federal requirement for that. This is Rhode Island specific. This is mainstream politics, corrupt politics, again, predisposing our communities to greater risk for the sake of maintaining the status quo with status quo politicians. And again, with whether it's the new guard or the old guard, people that work for one person instead of for the many people in our communities. So I want to put that out there and see what your thoughts are as a whole in terms of what the ACLU and the Rhode Island Secretary of State actually advocated for and how we might or could do better.
Well, if you'd like, I'll jump in on this one again. For the record, this is where I utter the 4 immortal words of every libertarian: I told you so. For the record, in the Board of Election meeting prior to the beginning of the signature collection period, there was great sturm and drang about what folks were going to do, and there's all sorts of discussion. We could possibly do this technology solution, that technology solution. And of course, at that point, with about a week and a half to go, it was clear that there was absolutely no way to implement any type of common sense based technology solution to catching signatures. Now, this is what folks have to understand, and And unless you've done signatures, I don't know if you can. So you stand outside of a Stop and Shop who may or may not be interested, who's, by the way, Stop and Shop Corporation has always been very supportive of establishment and grassroots candidates petitioning in front of their facilities. Very, very supportive. They've got some very basic rules. Don't take up both entrances. Other than that, and don't invade the space of customers, and don't be rude. Other than just common sense stuff, as a company, they've gone out of their way to give us access for years. So kudos to them. I want to point out the bright side, because the private sector is very cooperative. When you stand outside of a facility for hours at a time, and you have people walking up to you, and you have to invade their space, and this is under normal circumstances, and thrust a clipboard with a signature in front of them and try to explain, particularly if you're a grassroots candidate, you're not collecting signatures for Bill or Hillary or Bernie. You're going out there for Jo Jorgensen in our case. Wonderful woman, PhD from Clemson University, brilliant individual, make a hell of a president, but thoroughly unknown to the people of Rhode Island. So they're going to look at you awkwardly. Number two, in the political culture of Rhode Island, you don't want to put your name to anything that isn't part of the establishment politics, because somehow there's literally a fear in people that if they're seen signing this, or if the signatures are analyzed, that this will impact their job. I've had adults tell me that for years, believe it or not. So then you're asking them to sign something and then walk away. Your typical success rate, if you're a handsome fellow like me, and I'm being sarcastic, is probably 1 out of 5, 1 out of 6, 1 out of 7. That's under normal circumstances. Now, as I pointed out to the governor, and I'll put the video on this, and I pointed out to the Board of Elections, what you are asking people to do is to violate a principle that has been at the behest of the governor's office, acting in her capacity, using her executive powers, all right, established in March under this dreaded plague, to violate every single one of her principles, which is to pierce social distancing, to hand someone a pen, hand someone a device that's been used before, and at the same time wearing masks so that your voices are muffled. Try to explain to folks why you're asking them to sign a legal document. Good luck.
Yeah, exactly.
Good luck with that.
Good luck.
All right. We've got a candidate out in the field right now, Billy Hunt, great candidate, hardworking guy, has successfully gotten for a couple of cycles signatures, no complaints. Part of the process. I presented this to the Board of Elections. I said, here's a simple solution. Let's eliminate all the technology issues. A critical point, there is no overriding federal legislation that requires people to obtain signatures to gain ballot access. So I said, let's just eliminate it all. This way there'll be no problems. The signatures, of course, that are collected, in the past, great. This time, let's forget about it. And one of the Board of Election members actually said to me, well, that's not right. You have to earn your way onto the ballot. Imagine that. And in my
Let's
mind,
put that in perspective, Pat.
Right.
Let's put that in perspective, right? Earn your way. We all know that endorsed candidates, the party sponsors other members of the party to go out and to collect signature for endorsed candidates. So is that really earning your way? No. And I'm speaking from a place, Pat, you recall, where I was out there collecting over 1,000 signatures. It is hard work. And I understand this notion that, earning your way somehow demonstrates that you're committed to service, but it's not true that everybody has to do that. And there's even businesses built around paying people to collect signatures for those candidates that are well-funded who can afford that. So the Board of Elections is just out of touch. Sorry, Bill. Yeah.
I completely agree. And I remember being with you, Dr. Munoz, covering your campaign and being out there on Cape Verdean Independence Day, which, by the way, was a lovely festival and is, and was celebrated today at East Providence City Hall rather. But, it's all these different places and, you're chasing people down. And Pat, you made me laugh because you think about it. Now you're doing that with a mask on. You're approaching random people who probably 9 out of 10 of them don't even know who Nick Mattiello is to begin with. So they're not interested in the process. But the result of this, the fallout of this was totally predictable. David Coughlin, candidate for HD 60, dropped out. I tweeted out yesterday that he made the announcement, hey, look, and I'm going to read right here, I would not seek nomination signatures on an in-person one-to-one basis, and it became obvious 48 hours after sending email signature requests to voters in HD60 that this so-called ACLU Secretary of State-driven cyber nomination signature solution was not going to generate enough signatures. So right there is one example of someone lost. Paul Roselli, who's a senatorial candidate and sort of a perennial outside, progressive voice here in the state. He's a senatorial candidate in Burrillville, North Smithfield, and Gloucester. He made a video that he posted on his Facebook page yesterday of, quote unquote, just how simple it is to complete the e-signature, the cyber nomination process. The video was about 3 or 4 minutes long. You got all kinds of instructions of what the print has to be, how large it has to be, what has to be on there. You can't put it on a small piece of paper. Then you got to scan it just the right way. It's like cashing a check on your app. It's got to be just the right amount. Nobody's going to do this. It's a total disaster. It's establishment politics, and I'm proud to be an independent whenever I see things like this come up. And I think that people in Rhode Island need to wake up and realize, earning your way onto a ballot is something you're entitled to when you have the guts to put your name on the ballot. That's the earning your way on there.
And if I could just stick a dagger in the heart of all of this, all right? Right now, a variety of politicians engage in high-level pearl clutching and virtue signaling in order to make it easier for people to vote. That's wonderful. I can appreciate those efforts. But if, in fact, the state systemically engages in disenfranchisement by preventing candidates from running, what you're effectively doing is disenfranchising the voter because you are selecting who they can vote for. Sure, we can vote. In Soviet workers' paradise, you could always vote. All right. In every oppressive, every militaristic regime in the world, you can vote. You just don't get to vote for who you want to, and you're not given the range of choices. Now, that could be a libertarian. That could be a Green Party. The Green Party announced that they weren't going to even put a candidate on the ballot in Rhode Island. How is that helpful to democracy? The state of Rhode Island is actively engaged in voter suppression in order to maintain the primacy of the duopoly and effectively the primacy of the Democratic Party in the state. They're doing so at the grassroots level within their own party, and they're continued attacks on the Women's Democratic Caucus and on the folks who are in the progressive element of the party. They're doing so on independent grassroots candidates who would rise up and bring to an end 80 years of unfiltered, unvented, unmitigated corruption. And that's what's happening here in the People's Republic of Rhode Island.
Yep, that is true. And when Nellie Gorbea runs for governor in 2022, I want us all to remember that this tactic not only suppressed candidates that were maybe somewhat in line with mainstream politics. Perhaps it's easy for them to rationalize that, but it suppressed women of color, it suppressed communities of color, it suppressed minority candidates. We have to understand that people that are rising up to run for politics in communities that have been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 had to weigh their risk differently than if they were running for office in East Greenwich, right? And so when you're weighting the possibility of running differently based on a different risk profile, if you in fact want to live and to protect your life, protect the life of your children, of your family, and of your community members, then what would you decide? What would you decide? My thoughts and just my perspective is I would rather not run than to risk the lives of community members. And that's in any community. That's in any community. And anyone who is willing actively and intentionally to risk lives of community members, whether it's something that's ever said or not, shouldn't be running for office, because already they've abandoned the idea of service. Now, that may be radical to say in a time where there are candidates seeking nomination signatures because they're looking for ways to get on the ballot to advocate for the people. But there is a thin line there. There's a really thin line. Now, we talk about accountability. I do think it goes up. It goes up to the leaders that made the decision. So when the Secretary of State runs for governor in 2022, I'll make sure to remind her. So Roberto's on the call now.
Is there a safe way? Is there a safe way to actually collect those signatures? Is somebody doing it right? Because they're out there and they're doing it. But is somebody out there doing it right? Is there a safe way? I mean, how would you do it? You say you wouldn't if it means putting voters' lives at risk or the community's lives at risk. But is there a way to do it right now in this climate?
If I could jump in, we've got a candidate, Bill Hunt, who's running for state rep. To the state's credit, they did cut the number of signatures. But what he had to do, but they also undocumented until Bill brought it up to me yesterday, was that they've actually, from past years, cut the amount of time with which you can do it. You only have one weekend to do it. So you're asked to go out there in unrelenting summer heat. You're putting on, you're covering yourself up to whatever degree possible. And again, you have to approach strangers like this. A lot of folks are using disposable pens, so that they're one-time only used pens. You see how what utter lunacy this is, right? And then they're going up to people, and it's exhausting, it's dangerous, and it's state-sponsored. Brought to you by the very same people. Again, you've got the state on a daily basis reminding us not to do the very things that you are asking candidates and their supporters to do in order to achieve some level of political balance in this state. How royally screwed up is that? Isn't that the ultimate testament of the complete indifference of the Rhode Island leadership to the fate of folks who are marginalized in the grassroots and are simply trying to do it the right way at a time when so much of American political pressure is put onto people not to riot, not to engage in, God forbid, civil disobedience or otherwise disagreeable behavior, because we wouldn't want to piss anybody off, then the only other response is to engage in the political process, and we are actively disenfranchising those people from that. It is disgusting.
Yep. There are three ways, Roberto. Three ways. Three ways from my perspective. It's my opinion, and so let me just voice what those three ways are. One is remove the requirement for nomination signatures, period. That embodies the greatest morality when we're talking about whether we should displace risk between, again, candidates and community, or even have any risk present at all. The second way, informed consent. Does each party accept the risk? So right now, there's not a reasonable process to, when I say reasonable, right, there's not an easy process to have two parties agree digitally and to accept that they're agreeing to sign off digitally without having access barriers in terms of technology, right? Even in person, we have candidates that are going up to families and asking for signatures. That family did not accept the risk. That family did not say, you can come up to my family when I'm with my child and ask me for a signature and approach me and enter my bubble. So in person, I don't think there's a path there. And if there is an informed consent path, there are candidates that maybe are trying to do that. They're saying, hey, meet me at this park at this time if you agree to sign the signature. Sure. I still think that to have any type of informed consent, you need to explain the risk. It's not just, will you meet me for signatures? Will you meet me knowing that COVID-19 is present, that COVID-19 can affect your lungs, that it can affect your vascular system, that it can lead to stroke, that it can lead to blood clots, right? That's informed consent in a hospital. That's what you sign off when you're going into surgery, every possible outcome. So if we're going to address the way to have informed consent in a purely digital platform, we have authentication measures. We have the iPhone that takes your fingerprint and can lock your phone, right, and encrypt it. We have encryption devices. And there may be access issues there too. I don't want to diminish that. But for the most part, more people likely have mobile devices than they have scanners in their home. And so we have instruments at our disposal that can be authenticated, that can have dual authentication on them, that we can have individuals sign up for an application sponsored by the Rhode Island Secretary of State and mainstream politicians here, and ensure that both parties agree to in this signature exchange, right? And so that's what's important. And there's a digital footprint, and we can ask them to put their phone number in to confirm later. I mean, there are plenty of things to do. You have to understand, people that say that process is potentially built, there's fraud built into it, hackers, blah, 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 blah. What is the process now? The process is that you're signing on a piece of paper and you bring hundreds of signatures. I brought over 1,000 signatures to different city halls, right, or town halls around the state of Rhode Island. And you have people looking at the signatures. And if they see that two signatures kind of have the same L, they will actually cross out one of those signatures. And that's fine. That's why instead of going for 1,000 signatures, you go for 2,000, because you know that there's a human on the other side of that assessment that's going to make judgments that may be inaccurate, but their judgment will ultimately impact your total number of signatures collected. So how is that process with a human on the other side of that assessment any better than an iPhone that has a fingerprint authentication measure in place that can confirm that you were the person, the owner of that phone, that lives in this address, that signed off and nominated this individual to run for politics? Which of those two systems actually provides more security? So there is a way, Roberto, to do this in a way that has absolutely no risk to life. And for the small amount of risk it has to hackers and all of this stuff, it's minimal in the context of the importance of these nomination signatures. Because as Pat pointed out, there's no federal mandate. This is simply a filtering system for mainstream politics to keep people out.
Would have been a great application for blockchain, wouldn't it, Doctor?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking as well. I
It
saw
can still
Giovanni
be, you know,
Ferroci's face, light up on the screen,
Dropping the Giovanni Ferroci card. Nice. Well played, Bill. Well played.
Yeah. And look, there's again, if we're talking mail-in ballots, and I've gone into these debates on the technology front versus mail-in ballot. I understand the risk, and hacking is relatively easy, and blockchain is not 100% secure. So I get that, but these are nomination signatures, right? This is a monopoly game that we're having to play in the state of Rhode Island, and now it's become a game that's at the expense of human life potentially. And so again, I think that there is a better way. There was a better way. There were plenty of smart people. We're not the first people to present these ideas to the Board of Elections, to the Secretary of State, even to the ACLU, right? They're just ultimately playing the same political grandstanding game that they always do. So here we are. We've been on the call on the live stream for over 30 minutes now. We've touched on some important topics, right? We touched on microentities, on the current kind of social relaxation around COVID-19, and perhaps that's actually somehow contributing to the disregard or inattention as it relates to our local economies. We talked about the potential aftermath of those local economies, falling to pieces, and the impact it might have on our education system, and the lack of preparation that we have to allocate funds in an equitable way to our local economies and our education system. And we've touched on the injustices that have been embedded systematically in not only voter suppression, which is a whole nother conversation, but in candidate suppression, right? Stopping people from running that would actually challenge the status quo and make Rhode Island a better place. And so I think with that, we've covered some of the biggest facets of this crisis that we're facing here in Rhode Island in 2020. And what I want to do now, after summarizing that for our listeners, is to hand this conversation back to each of my co-hosts so that they can talk to us about what their outrage is and how we can move forward in the coming week. Let's start with Bill.
Very simple at this point. My issue, if you will, it's almost at the outrage level, but my issue is, how is Rhode Island going to step up as a leader when it comes to retaining low testing numbers, retaining low testing results? All right, we've got a case on Block Island now. Okay, I was in Newport this weekend and observed utter chaos. If I was the mayor of Newport, I would have printed a jacket, like a mechanic's jacket with my name on it. I would have written Mayor Bova on it, put the Newport emblem on. I would have had somebody with a camera walking around downtown and asking people from a distance, hey, what are you doing without a mask on? Why are you coming to our city? Going into restaurants, restaurant owners that were allowing people to come in without masks. Okay, we got takeout food at one place, and I'm not going to name the spot, but it's a place that a lot of people go to when they visit Newport. And what an utter mistake to go into that facility and see, people grasping at common objects like pens and so on and so forth to sign receipts, no masks, yelling and screaming. All right. So the question now is, without infringing on civil liberties and without causing further injustice to be portrayed from a social standpoint in this crisis, what ingenuity will we see from municipal and state leaders to enforce or at least further encourage, all right, techniques, mechanics that will continue to at least keep the virus at the place that it is right now in Rhode Island, which is, as far as we know, a low point. What can we see? What will change that now that we are seeing the inundation of tourists, now that we're seeing people who are local, frankly, it's not just tourists that are out there, you know, risking the spread of the virus. What's the next step? How do we get there? It's not going to come from the 12 o'clock, pardon me, the 1 o'clock press conference and the please wear your mask and the unfortunate deaths and the whole thing. It's going to have to come from a place that's very soulful and more reminiscent probably of our political leadership of, the 1700s, not the quality of human being necessarily, but the type of soulfulness that is portrayed, the responsibility that's portrayed, in order for us to stay at a point where this thing is not going to spiral out of control as what's happening in the Sun Belt and in the southern part, in the Southwest and throughout the southern portions of the country right now, with 10,000 cases just today in Texas, makes its way to Rhode Island. How do we suppress that?
Yeah, I mean, great questions, Bill, and it's something we'll have to reflect on, and maybe that'll be what we'll start with next week, right? Start that conversation back up. So, Pat, what's your outrage?
Well, first of all, to amplify a point on Bill, irony is defined as witnessing the single largest peaceful demonstration potentially in Rhode Island history and realizing virtually no growth in the disease, despite the claims of so many folks who were so quick to castigate our young people in Rhode Island for what they considered an irresponsible program. And then reflect on the behavior by a largely white middle to upper middle class crowd in Newport this weekend, as Bill can attest to. And let's just hope that we didn't just redefine irony in a way that will impact the history of Rhode Island. But to briefly, and I'll make it quick too, because I want obviously Roberto, I have a little time. My disgust, and it isn't even frustration, disgust, is that here we are, and Bill can attest to this. I've been to a number of the press conferences recently, and I'm trying to ask hard financial questions, because not only is equity an important part of this, not only is science an important part of this, not only is responsibility to each other a part of this, not only is how we mechanically handle the COVID crisis, it's how we anticipate as communities, the stewards of our money, our resources, our treasure, our income streams, whatever, how are they preparing for the coming storm? And it is apparent to me that, as we say from Jersey, where I'm from, denial ain't a river in Egypt. We've got the executive branch hoping, when you wish upon a star, hopefully bailout funds will come from afar. That's what's happening on the municipal level. Providence needs to actually people need to demand Providence start looking at a structured, responsible bankruptcy process, because simply it's the math. And on a municipal process across the state and across the municipal governments, there has been little or no attempt at restructuring costs. Minimal layoffs, minimal research, as if somehow we can just deny our way through this, like some people want to deny their way through the existence of this disease. It's coming, whether you like it or not. It's going to happen whether you're prepared or not. And it's time for the residents to demand from our leaders, our elected solons, or sometimes self-appointed ones, what their approach is going to be to funding education and to keeping the doors of basic goods and services open to Rhode Islanders when this storm truly hits.
Yeah, thank you, Pat, for sharing that. Roberto?
We talked about budget cuts earlier. We talked about students being affected, educational opportunities being affected, and political responses. And I think something that everybody should know is we've got a local ass kicker in Providence, Moira Walsh, and Moira's about to be challenged by somebody named Nathan Bia. Nathan Bia is the administrator for Alvarez High School, and it has, besides the 2020 chaos, it has been a rough year there. This was a transition year for him, and hopefully it's only up to go. But It was a really rough year, and some of the things that I'm not fond of. We had direct conflict, we had direct confrontation, we had a lot of direct problems with each other. I think at first, but one of my main concerns was that while Steambox was still in the building, we stripped down the wellness opportunities at that school that made that community so special. We had Brother Ray in the building, who was a wellness specialist. We had educators, Courtney Price, who ran an organization called Young Ladies Association at the school. Rich Norris moved on to become an administrator in another building, and he was running an amazing gentleman's academy in the school as well. But most of those were against their will. And the idea was by Nathan Beer was that we were going to reinvest in technology elsewhere, and it just wasn't true. There was a new like fancy whiteboard added into one of the lounges. But I digress. Anyway, he's going to be involved in an upcoming election, and I think we should pay very close attention to it because I don't want to influence anybody else's opinion, but I recommend you check out Moira Walsh to see what she stands for, because she stands for a lot. I will say that I touched base with one of those students today when it comes to my outrage, and I can't even call it outrage. It's really just emotional sadness. She is, like many of my students, a brown person from New York, and a lot of her family was in New York. And the last time I had talked to her, I do these wellness checks. We have conversations. I call it office hours, where students can just get in touch with me. Last time I talked to her, a lot of her family was sick. A lot of her family had gotten the COVID-19, and so one of the first things that I asked her was, how's your family doing? That was one of the last things we talked about. Are they okay? And as casual as can be, she says, no, a lot of them died. And it almost, she almost shuffled on to the next part of the conversation. And I'm like, hold up, are you okay? And she's like, what are you going to do? Right. And she herself is an essential worker. She's out making sure we're getting fast food and stuff like that where she works. But it kind of broke my heart. I'm like, were these people close to you? And how much? I don't really know how to human well. So I'm like trying to pace myself accordingly. And they were aunts and stuff. And it was just really heartbreaking. And she's like, yes, they were close to me. And I'm like, are you okay? And she's like, no, there's a lot of days where I'm not okay. And it all comes back to wellness. And no, there's not a budget being put back into this. To Pat's credit earlier when he was seeking my response, but my response is probably not what you think it would be. I am absolutely for the first time ever optimistic. I've been working in education for over 20 years, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse. But we are in a very special time because we're in the middle of an apocalypse pandemic. It's the closest thing that I've ever had to an apocalypse. We are in the middle of a racial crisis across the United States, and we're dealing with a lot of that directly in the school. And we are in the middle of the Johns Hopkins report, which was scathing for Providence. It was really, really bad. And the point is, we are at ground zero. Like, how could it really get much worse than where we are today? And the good news, and the reason I say that's good news, is because people are starting to hold other people accountable. They're starting to ask questions like, well, how do we get more budget here? Do we really need all that budget for the police department, right? I haven't seen that here, but we've seen pictures of communities with like Lamborghini police cars and tanks and all that shit. Do we really need that much budget here? Can we start to reinvest in educational opportunities? And we've also seen that crisis leads to innovation. And I can tell you that I've seen it with Steambox, and I recommend that people check out Steambox and try to figure out how to participate, but not just with my organization. There's a lot of organizations out there that are working on this stuff right now with students. And what I'm telling you is, and this isn't credit to me, this is part of a group that I'm working with, we are talking about treating the whole student. And by that, I don't mean, obviously there's a crisis in their mathematics skills and a number of other things, but we need to make sure that our students are well, and they are not well. And we need to bring back a lot of those devices. And again, we're in a period of innovation, so I'm very excited. But it only works if Pat, Bill, Dr. Munoz, our listeners, our watchers, if we can stand up and say, right now is the time to do something. But again, the reason I'm optimistic is because as I look around, there is a response to people getting murdered in the streets. There is a response to the pandemic. People are frustrated. People are angry. And now is the time that we actually will do something. I think it's going to happen.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Roberto. I agree 100% that leaders rise out of crisis, right? And there are plenty of leaders that can step up if they have the courage to do so. But there's also a lot of leadership within our youth, and we've seen a lot of that in recent days and over the past month. And hopefully we'll see more of it. You know, my outrage is kind of, I would say, a melding of everyone's outrage today, which is that we have this potential to change the face of Rhode Island, both literally, if we're talking about candidates that can run for office or should run for office in the coming elections, but also figuratively in terms of the institutions that have, dominated the state, how they've been run operationally. And we have an opportunity to improve those institutions and to create an equitable formula in how we fund education and how we support micro entities. My concern is that even though leaders, and to focus on youth here, can rise out of a crisis, I think that there does need to be a nurturing environment. We do need to have those support systems set up. And whether it's intentional or not, when we talk about systemic racism, there are oppressive tactics. There are ways of taking the potential leaders that might rise up and pushing them back down, right? And removing the tools that they would normally have to change the very systems that they suffered under. And that is my concern in moving forward. It's the generational trauma. I do think that, even though we may be in ground zero, I don't think that we necessarily have seen the worst of this crisis. I think that we have not seen what it's like for as much as in New York City, for instance, as when compared to New York City, at least, families dying in their homes. We haven't seen what other countries have seen, which is that there are not enough ambulances to pick up the dead and for the dead to be placed outside for the ambulances to pick them up. I hope we never see that in the United States. I hope we never see that in Rhode Island. But think about the generational trauma that we're going to experience from the crisis we've experienced so far. And without the support systems in place to even address that, how do we address the potential for greater trauma, right? How do we address that? And I don't know if it's outrage or concern or fear, and not so much fear that I can't live with, but fear that there are people that may experience these things that won't necessarily be able to live with it, and won't have the support systems to be able to live with it. And so when I think about moving forward, I think my outrage stems from that, a need and a desire to protect our communities and to ensure that they have resources, but just knowing that we have an administration that does not care, right? That we have tools that ultimately follow suit, fall in line, and don't challenge the institutions. And this is not just about being radical. Honestly, it stirs my blood. Like it could be 8:30 at night. I could have worked a 16-hour shift, and it is hard to remain tempered when we're faced with a very real threat that people that we know, our loved ones, our community members, have either already died, some of them, and some of them may be at risk of dying. And these are people that they could be our family, but they could just be a part of our community family. So in moving forward, in a path forward, I just want to put this out there into the world and put this out there to our listeners that, don't wait until it's personal enough, right? Don't wait until it's personal enough. Address the issues now. Stand up, get loud, fight for the resources, vote out the politicians, drag them out of office if you have to, but do not wait until it's someone that you love that suffered under the injustices that we've talked about today. So with that said, I want to thank all of the co-hosts that have joined me again on this Tuesday. I welcome you all back for next week, and this Pump Up the Volume wouldn't be the same without you. And thanks to our listeners. See us back here next Tuesday, 7:30 p.m. on Pump Up the Volume.